Hello, and welcome to Wait for It, Independence, Increasing Independence for Individuals Using Augmentative and Alternative Communication. This is hosted by the Florida Atlantic University, the Center for Autism and Related Disabilities, and PEPSA, the Partnership for Effective Programs for Students with Autism. The mission of the FAU Center for Autism and Related Disabilities, or CARD, provides expert consulting, training, and support at no charge for all people across all race, ethnic, and gender groups with autism and related disabilities, their families, employers, the professionals and community and governmental agencies serving them. The vision of FAU CARD is that it provides support and assistance with the goal of optimizing the potential of all people across all race, ethnic, and gender groups with autism and related disabilities. The counties they serve are 5 counties: Indian River, St. Lucie County, Martin County, Okeechobee County, and Palm Beach County. And they have 3 offices in Boca Raton, Jupiter, and Port St. Lucie, providing one dynamic service. Services offered at no charge include family and school consultations, trainings and workshops, public education, referrals and resources, adult hangouts groups, and much more. And let me introduce myself. My name is Mike Cole, and I am a speech language pathologist practicing in the state of Illinois. I'm centered in Aurora, just 35 miles straight west of Chicago, which everything in that area is a suburb of Chicago. So welcome in, and good to see you all today. A little background about myself. I started out in the school setting, straight out of college, working in self-contained classrooms with individuals with severe communication needs and complex communication needs. And my interest in augmentative and alternative communication really started from that group of individuals that I was working with, because I was constantly struggling working and trying to figure out what I can do to help those individuals communicate better. I could get a basic start, I could get some results, but really those next steps of increasing that language output, building that communicative independence were areas that I really struggled. And so I'm going to speak to you today on some of my experiences and some of my successes and some of my failures, as well as what I've learned along the way that can be successful and help these individuals become more independent and more communicative. From that beginning in the self-contained classrooms, I also worked in the general education setting, working with some more general education students, but also with those individuals who have complex communication needs who are in that setting as well. And from there, I moved up into assistive technology for the school district that I worked with, and became a consultant within the school district, helping staff implement augmentative and alternative communication tools, complete assessments for feature matching to find the best augmentative and alternative communication tools that match the needs of the students that I work for, as well as other tools working on addressing access to reading, access to writing, physical access, and vision access as well. And from that area, I moved into private practice, where I've been since 2012. And in my private practice, I focus mainly on individuals who use augmentative and alternative communication. Some disclosures on my end. I am president of Use Your Words PC, which is my company that I work for. And my non-financial disclosure is that I have an unpaid position on the American Board of Augmentative and Alternative Communication. So why do we want independence? And that seems like an obvious question to ask there. But we really need to think outside of the box and our area and our time with the individuals that we work with. In the school setting, it's very easy to be very focused on what I'm working on this year with this student. Or, I'm in middle school, which is where I started out, and I have a quick 3 years that I get to work with this student. And it's really easy to focus on that small area and work within those time constraints. But really, within the time that you have these students and individuals, we really need to be thinking long-term and beyond me. What am I going to do to help prepare this student to be beyond me and have success down the road, rather than to just meet my immediate goals or the immediate goals of the classroom, or in that micro sort of view there. And so the ability to communicate really affects the quality of life, especially all along the way, right? If you're able to communicate something as small as I have a headache, that's a medical need there, that needs to be communicated, that typically developing and speaking students get to communicate and get to have resolved, whereas individuals who have complex communication needs and don't have a method to communicate, unfortunately, get to sit there with their headache, and we have to try to guess what's wrong. We need to be thinking about the activities that we're doing leading to independent communication in the long term, moving beyond just task completion. We need to get this done in this manner, in this specific activity today. Are our goals and the activities that we're doing with these students focusing on the long term and viewing them through the lens of becoming adults and moving beyond school? Okay, so those are the things that we need to think about. The school bus is going to stop coming one day. Okay, and when the school bus stops coming, these individuals don't have the support of the school and the staff on a daily basis, and have the support of their families. Okay, and even long term, we have to keep thinking, and we hate to think about this way too, but the students often outlast the parents, right, of the families, which is, as it should be. And so we need to be thinking about long term, what am I doing today to help that individual be more independent into adulthood? So our goal is really autonomous communication. The ability to communicate is the number one determiner of quality of life. Because if you think about it, it's everything. It affects everything in our day, right? We're able to convey information. We're able to socially interact. We're able to get medical needs met. We're able to do simple things like eat and drink because we're able to communicate and let others know that, hey, we're hungry, let's go out, to a restaurant, or I'm ready for dinner now. So the ability to communicate really affects that overall quality, and it affects independence as well. Individuals that don't communicate are often moved throughout their day by other individuals, right? What do we say? Little Johnny or little Susie, it's time to be done with this task and we're going to go on, and it's time to go home. Or you're going to be done with your iPad now and it's time to go outside, right? Kids who are verbal and able to protest or speak are able to do so. And then we're able to work through those problems. Individuals who are unable to protest or unable to communicate or talk out situations are just taken through the activity and taken through their day. So we really need to be thinking about autonomous communication in a manner that allows the individual to control their life and to meet their needs. And so again, when we're working with these individuals, we need to be thinking about that in the tasks and activities that we're doing. Are these goals and activities here just to meet this one little thing we need to do? Or are we keeping in mind the long-term goals of autonomous communication? So autonomous communication is described by adults who use augmentative and alternative communication as being able to say what I want to say to whoever I want to say it to, whenever I want to say it. Okay, these are the words that I keep in the back of my mind when I'm working with with the individuals using augmentative and alternative communication. Autonomous communication is not really achieved until the person is able to say what they want to say to whoever they want to say it to, whenever they want to say it. So how do we create competent communicators? One of the ways to do that is to look at the 4 communicative competencies. There's the operational competency, the linguistic competency, the social competency, and strategic competency. And these resources are taken from Janice Light et al. In the operational portion, We look at the development of the technical skills to use and operate the augmentative and alternative communication system. And this includes both high-tech systems, low-tech systems, and mid-technology systems. Can the students operate, or can the individuals that are using these systems operate them? Can he or she turn them on? Can he or she adjust the volume of it? Can he or she charge it if it needs charging? Can he or she change paper overlays if there are paper overlays? Can he or she turn pages if pages need to be turned? So we look at things like the ability to access the communication system to translate information. So for example, can he or she touch? Can he or she tear, pull, point? Can we use eye gaze? Can we use switches to access the system? So we need to look at the ability of the individuals to actually access the communication device. One of the cases that comes to mind is a young man with cerebral palsy that I was working with, and he was set up with switches on his communication device. And what would happen is it would take him so long to form any utterances that it looked like he actually wasn't trying. So when I first sat in for a session with him with these switches, it would take him an hour to put together a 3-word utterance. And what I saw from this individual was not a lack of trying. He actually worked very hard throughout the entire session to try to formulate that 3-word message. He was determined to get a message out. But upon a closer look at the switches and how they were working for him, they operated as mouse controls. And as he would push the switch, the mouse would move up, and then the mouse pointer would assume that since you're still operating it, you want to go further. And so at one point, it would go faster up the screen to try to get to where you wanted to get. Well, this resulted in him reacting in a spasm because it was a jump on the screen. And as a result of his cerebral palsy, it caused him to spasm as well. And then he'd have to get his body reorganized, try to get a hold of the switch again, and then move it again. And the same thing would happen when the switch moved. And so we eliminated the jump on there, but still saw that it took him forever to be able to manipulate and operate those switches to formulate words. We switched instead to eye gaze for him and found out that the rate at which he accessed his communication device went up exponentially. And this was a discussion actually amongst the team and the family and other outside consultants as well as to which method would be the best access method for him. Trying those different access methods and taking some data and information on him, it was very easy to show that his rate of access increased exponentially with what he was able to do. He could easily form an utterance within a minute now, which included much more than 3 words, up to 10 words. And so it was much easier to show that his access method, the switches, were not an appropriate method for him because, again, it caused him such effort to access, but instead eye gaze was the better access method for him. And so if we look at a device and see somebody is not pressing buttons or not able to access or not able to pull or not able to tear or turn pages, we need to look back and say, is our access method we're using appropriate, or do we need to think about something else? So the linguistic area that we need to look at is actually the language part and the language component. Okay, and we need to look at it as mastery of the native language spoken by the community, expressive and receptive. Okay, and emphasis on native language there because there are clients and patients who speak multiple languages or a different language in the home and a different language at school. And so we need to be able to take that into account when we are working with these individuals on their communication systems. We need to look at learning the symbols used to represent the vocabulary in the AAC system. Now, I want to caution, this is to be careful with this. It is not required that an individual knows symbols before accessing a communication system. Okay, that's a very important part. That's one of the discussion points I come across frequently in working with individuals. Well, he or she can't identify symbols yet, so they're not ready for a communication system. And that, in fact, is an incorrect approach. There are no prerequisites to augmentative and alternative communication. And if we think about typically developing children, many of them try words, okay, which is the symbolic representation of language, without knowing what they mean. So I'll give an example because my kids are actually at that developmental age. My son came up to me one day and he goes, "Dad, you are awesome." I'm like, "Wow, that's great." I mean, especially from a 5-year-old, that's wonderful. I thank you so much. I appreciate that. And then he looks back at me and goes, "Dad, what's awesome?" He had no idea what it meant. He heard somebody use the word, saw the reaction of the person who got the word, and obviously it was a pretty positive reaction. So he figured he'd try it out on me. He did not know the definition of awesome or what that represented before he tried it. But because he tried it, saw my reaction, we could then discuss what that meant. Okay. And so we need to allow the individuals using augmentative and alternative communication to do the same thing. Social area. Uh, this refers to the actual social interaction back and forth, initiating conversations, maintaining conversations, responding appropriately, ending conversations, being responsive to your communication partner. That's the social area or the social competency that we need to be aware of. And the strategic competency, and this refers to language repair. So if I communicate something and it's not understood by the listener, what strategy do I have to make that understood? So, for example, maybe I'm an individual who uses gestures at home, and I can gesture to my mom and dad, and they understand what that means to get that item for me. Okay, I had an individual I worked with where he had an idiosyncratic gesture, which this is drink. And that's what he used for drink. And that was his sign. And that's obviously not a standard sign for drink that many people would understand outside of the family. And so in his family, when he went like this, great, that worked for drink. When he was in school or out in public, this didn't work. So do I have a strategy to communicate drink to somebody when this is not understood? Okay, that's the strategic competency. So where do we look for independence with individuals? Well, the participation model by Buchanan and Miranda gives us the guidance for that. Okay, so first we need to identify participation patterns and communication needs. Okay, so this is looking at the environment of the individual. How is he or she communicating now? What does he or she need to communicate? And then where do we go from there? We assess opportunity barriers. Okay, so what are the barriers that get in the way? Is it like that individual with cerebral palsy? Is it access to the device that gets in the way of the barrier? Is it gaining attention? Is it a school policy that gets in the way? That's a barrier. There was one school district that I worked with around here that they had a requirement that nobody shall try a high-tech communication device until they get past PEPSA phase 5. Okay, and that there's no evidence to support that, and we've had that discussion and since moved on, which is great. But that was a school policy barrier that needed to be addressed. We need to plan opportunity interventions. Okay, create those opportunities and those situations for individuals to interact, and that can sound like a very rigid plan setting things up, but that's also just to emphasize that the one-on-one therapy session is not sufficient. Okay. When I'm working with individuals, I'm working with their families, I'm pulling in caregivers. We go out into the community, into stores that they frequent. And so that's something to bear in mind, is that it's really easy to get focused on our interaction back and forth, but really we need to allow opportunities for individuals to communicate. Okay, so that's just kind of a mental reminder for us that this one-on-one work, we may be able to target a specific skill, but it's not really going to carry over until we give opportunity to apply it in other settings or other situations. Okay, assessing access barriers, again, that can focus on the access to the communication device. Things like, do we have our communication tool with us when we go out into public? That's a question I ask frequently as well. Do we have the method or mode to communicate, or does it just sit in the backpack and come out when it's communication time and leave when it's communication time? Okay, we need to have that ability to communicate everywhere because we have our mouths with us everywhere. plan and implement interventions for today and tomorrow. Again, that's thinking about now and the long term for that. So is what I'm working on now going to translate into a need for something long term? Okay, so we need to think about our short-term steps and then our long-term goals. And then we need to evaluate the intervention effectiveness. Okay, and this is where we have a little heart-to-heart with ourselves. And I've developed a much better ability to do this along the way as well. If an intervention or a communication method is not working, or if a client or child or whoever is not improving, we have to ask the question, what are we doing that's not allowing him or her to improve, rather than, well, he or she just can't get it. They're just not going to get it. You know, that is not going to help the situation. And I have an example later on here where I will talk to you about that, about a young man that I was working with. The participation model, this is the first step broken down. So this is step one broken down here. We need to look at the academic area. Competitive academics, active, are they involved? Are they not involved? We need to look at the social area, who's influential in their lives. Are they an active participant? Are they involved? Or do they have nobody that they're interacting with on a regular basis? Are they in the inclusion? How are they included? Are they full, selective, or not included in the educational environment or in any environment that they're in? Look at independence. Do they have complete independence? Are we able to set things up? And so then that allows them to be independent, or are they assisted? Okay, so these are all the things that we're looking at for the participation model. This is step one right here, where we identify participation patterns and communication needs. So that's a further breakdown of step one to look at. When do we start with communicative independence? Well, waiting to start is a much bigger concern. I'll answer that question right there. Children with severe communication deficits who receive only speech therapy often endure years of being without an effective means of communication. Okay, and nowhere has that become more apparent to me than when I moved into private practice. I'm getting calls from individuals who are 30, 40 years old, who have never had a communication system. Okay, so think about that. You've made it through 30 to 40 years of your life without a way to communicate. Okay, and we need to think about that back in the school system and back in the school setting. And this is something I didn't realize as well when I was in the school setting until I moved further along in my career. But if nothing is implemented there to intervene on behalf of communication, after that child leaves school, chances are even smaller, because again, those parents don't have the support of the speech therapist, the OT, the PT, the special education teacher, the LBS1, so on and so forth, after that child leaves school. Okay, so it's really our responsibility in the school setting, especially even at the younger ages, to look at, okay, what do we need to get in place to communicate? There was a young lady with spinal muscular atrophy that I saw when she was 3 years old. And the family had been told that this person was, too young for a high-tech communication device. And so she had started with another method of communication, and we found out that the access and the attention required for that one was too much for her. So she couldn't attend to it. And then just the speed at which was not the speed at which she wanted to move. She wanted to go faster. And so did an evaluation, feature matching, found out what was most appropriate for her, and actually implemented high-tech communication with eye gaze. And lo and behold, she's able to get out more words with more frequency. And along the way, she is using it in play activities to talk about what she's doing. She's retelling information about what she did during her day. And so now we have things that we can work with and build her language. Studies have shown that even normally developing children who are communicated with in both sign language and speech during infancy appear to communicate initially with signs and develop spoken language at a much younger age than would otherwise have been expected. Okay, and that's something to bear in mind, because sign language is another form of augmentative and alternative communication, right? And we have no hesitation doing that because we're used to it. And it's been advertised. We have things like baby signing time, and so on and so forth. And it's just kind of universally accepted that that's a great method for intervention. But when we start looking at other augmentative and alternative communication tools, it's a less accepted, kind of an area, or there's less of a knowledge base for individuals at this young. So really, when does communication start? There's research evidence that babies in the womb begin to recognize and hear and understand voices, right? And so with that in mind, once we recognize there's communication issues, we need to put things in place to allow that communication and provide access to that communication, okay? The other reason that we can't wait is because of language development here. Okay. More time waiting results in less language practice. Language development results from the interaction between expressive communication, receptive communication, reading, and writing. Okay, we need all four of those to be able to develop language. If there's damage in any one of those areas, it affects language development. And so, especially if we don't have a way for expressive communication, then we're inhibiting language development. We need to put something in place to provide that individual access to communication. And that's the way to think about it, is access. Okay. We need to think about it like a pair of glasses, right? I right now, which you may or may not be able to tell, am wearing contacts. Okay. Because my vision is such that I can't access written information or anything that I might need to see over some distance. But to accommodate that, I wear contacts, and I also have glasses that I wear as well, right? So having those things allows me to access my environment and allows me to learn. It also increases my safety because I can read signs that tell me I don't need to go there, or there's a wet floor, or things like that. So we need to be thinking about communication tools like a pair of glasses. It provides that access to speech and to communication. Okay, and it provides us, it completes that circle of language development. And that's also to bear in mind that with these individuals, we do need to be thinking about reading. We do need to be thinking about writing. We do need to think about receptive communication and listening more than, and I caution receptive because when I see receptive goals, it tends to be direction following, right? Most of my communication really isn't direction following. Most of my communication is interacting back and forth and conveying information and receiving information, right? Direction following is part of it, but we need to bear in mind that receptive communication does encompass more than receptive direction following. Okay. And this comes from David Koppenhaver and David Yoder and the others that you see mentioned there. But it's important to mention that David Koppenhaver and Karen Erickson really do talk about this in depth with the reading and the writing with individuals with complex communication needs, and have created or call their work comprehensive literacy instruction. So I highly recommend looking into their work for working on reading and writing. That's another presentation in itself, quite a bit. So is it too late to implement AAC? Research has shown that many individuals with significant disabilities continue to develop their communication and language skills throughout their young adult years. So that's something to keep in mind. I've received individuals who are 18 in the school system, and the concern was, well, is it too late? Are they going to learn anything? And the answer is yes. And that's even emphasized more now that I'm in private practice and seeing older individuals start with communication systems, and they improve and they learn. And that's what the research evidence shows. You and I continue to learn into our adult years. You're watching this webinar right now to increase your knowledge. You don't stop learning at any particular juncture. Okay, and so that's something to keep in mind. It's never too late to start augmentative and alternative communication with individuals. So how do we build independence now, given that information? We've looked at the environment of the person. We've looked at barriers to access. We've looked at social needs. We've looked at physical access. And we've looked at at our results, determining whether or not what we do is effective. And so looking at the 4 areas of communicative competencies. And so how do we take that and then start to build independence with it? So the key is to move beyond therapy. Okay, this was a paradigm shift for me along the way as well, because it's my job as a speech language therapist to have this wonderful plan, sit down, do this with you during our time, get everything done, hop up, and then leave, right? But that really limits the independence of the individual and the progress that we made. So because I did something with that person, which may or may not have been successful, which probably won't transfer out of that session. And on top of that, I'm the SLP who works with the communication tool, whatever it is, and then it's done. Okay. And that really emphasizes that point if I run therapy that way to everybody else on my team. Okay. Or the family of the individual as well. I'm the person who does that. Okay. But that really, really limits the results and really limits independence. Now, what I tell people is I'm your coach. Okay. So we're going to do therapy, quote unquote, and I'm going to work with, you know, your student, your son, your daughter. But really what I'm doing is working through and with you and training everyone else how to do this and how to work with communication with this individual so that we can begin to carry this over in multiple settings and multiple environments. So the answer to that is we use the natural environment to the greatest extent possible. Okay, so I use the tools that are in the classroom, the equipment that's in the classroom. You know, if there's something particularly specialized that I see that is needed for a session to get a result from this student or child, you know, I will bring that in and use it, but then I will make it available across the environment. Okay, I'm always conscious of using the natural environment to communicate as much as possible because that's what we all use. Right? I don't go into my room and say, okay, now is Mike will speak time. And then when I leave, Mike is done speaking, right? So we need to keep that in mind for the individuals that we work with. Don't make up special AAC time. Okay. And I make extra emphasis of that. I try not to sit at the table, set up the communication device, set up the activity, and then hold up and go back and forth in that manner. Okay. If I set up at the table, it's because we're doing an activity together that the person can participate in or is a skill that he or she might enjoy. Okay. And that's the approach from it. I'm not, you know, holding things up and saying, oh, that's right, or oh, that's wrong. Instead, we're talking about the activity that we're doing back and forth. And then you're also, as a result, more likely to get carryover because parents and families at home and teachers at school don't have time to sit down and make individual therapy time, right? That's not the reality of our lives. And so by using the natural environment as much as possible and training others to participate, we make it something that's part of their day rather than a specified therapy time. Okay. The next thing we need to talk about is aided language stimulation. Okay. You might have heard it called modeling as well. And that's where we use the communication tool. Okay. We have to communicate in the manner that we expect the students or the children to communicate in. Okay. So that's something to bear in mind. When a child first is born, it's about a year to a year and a half before he or she will speak their first words, right? And during that time, he or she has had 4,380 hours of language modeling. That's an example quote from Jane Corstman. And that modeling has occurred 8 hours a day for that individual, at least, right? They get modeling from mom and dad, they get modeling from relatives, they hear the radio, they hear TV, they hear all those things. And so they get all that modeling and we communicate with them, we speak with them, expecting nothing back for that year to year and a half, right? Because that baby's not talking back to us, we don't go, oh, I'm not going to speak to you, right? And we don't create the demand either that I won't speak to you until you speak to me, right? With that individual. So what we're doing with somebody with a communication tool, whether it's high tech, low tech, mid tech, we're putting it in front of that individual and we're saying, use that to communicate. By the way, I don't use it. Your mom and dad doesn't use it. You don't see the teachers use it. You don't see most individuals in your environment using it. Okay, so already just by doing that, we've shot over the head of that student shot far higher in expectations than we would shoot even for a typically developing person, right? So we need to use aided language stimulation to model and communicate in the manner that he or she is going to communicate. It validates the system as a form of communication. Okay, so it shows this individual that we're using this tool to speak. It slows down the rate of the communication partner because now we have to communicate using the tool that the student or child is using, right? And so, but the benefit of that is for the student or child who's learning language is that it slows us down so it allows for that student to process, okay, and hopefully gain more information. On top of that, we're usually modeling visually and having the words emphasized while we model on their communication system as well. It provides the additional visual model that I just mentioned. It identifies location and possible lack of vocabulary. So this is key, right? I can't tell the number of sessions I've sat in where, oh, we're going to talk about this today. We're going to talk about ice skates. Oh, I don't know where that is in the device. Well, we'll find that later. So here we're going to talk about ice skates, and then we're going to go forward, and then we move on from there. And the next time happens, okay, oh, we're doing this ice skate activity. Oh, I don't quite remember where that, we didn't find that yet. Okay, well, here we're going to do the activity, and then so on and so forth. Okay, so we keep trying to remember to find the word on the device or the communication tool, whatever it is, but we never quite do it. And then what we come to find out is when we do find out that word ice skates wasn't in their communication system. And so there was no chance to communicate about that for the individual, right? But using his or her communication device while we speak and while we teach right away lets us know, oops, this is missing. Okay, I got to program that in. We got to put that in. We got to print it out. We got to practice spelling it, whatever mode you're using to communicate. And when I do this and ask staff and parents and families to do this, they're often surprised at the words that are not in the device that might be needed for their daily activities. It sensitizes the facilitators to difficulties inherent in using AAC approaches as forms of expression. So it reminds us what we're asking the individual to do on their communication system, right? Again, we don't use communication systems because it's much more difficult than just speaking. Okay. And oftentimes what we don't realize is the need to wait for the individual, or that there are multiple things happening when that individual communicates, right? He or she is trying to find where that button is, where that picture is, how to spell it on the keyboard, where to point to it, in addition to the word that they're actually trying to think of to say as well. And so we need to be cognizant of that we're asking them to do these tasks. The number one thing that is successful, especially when I come into a situation, and this is pretty much every situation, which is why they usually come talk to me, is that he or she is not using their device. Okay, and the first thing I ask is, anyone else using the device in front of the student or he or she? And the answer is often no. And I say, okay, well, let's start. And I sit down with the individual and start using the device in front of him or her. And almost every time, I don't have an exact percentage of this, but almost every time he or she starts using that device right away. Okay, unless there's some sort of access issue to it. But almost every time he or she starts using that device right away. And it's an aha moment for the team, staff, and families that, okay, we do need to model on this to show that it is a valid form of communication. All right. How do we scaffold independence? Okay. What type of prompting do we look at when we talk about augmentative and alternative communication systems? Least to most, most to least. All right. Let's take a look. Least to most is generally the prompting hierarchy that we need to be looking at with these individuals. Okay. Oftentimes I see hand over hand, where we're taking the individual's hand, we're touching the picture that they need, pulling the picture that they need, touching the button they need to, getting them to push the button that we want them to push. Okay. And invariably with hand over hand, what I see is eyes go like this from the individual. because I don't need to pay attention anymore necessarily. You're going to make me push what you want me to push. I may or may not even know what that word means. I may or may not even know what's going to happen. Okay. And physically taking somebody and moving them is a pretty power move, right? Because you are taking his or her body and you are making it do what you want it to do. Okay. So physical prompting should be pretty much avoided at, not pretty much, it should be avoided at all costs. Okay. I avoid physical prompting like the Dickens when I'm doing work with individuals with AAC. The one exception that I will make for physical prompting is if he or she just doesn't know how it works. Okay. So for example, if I don't know that I can touch the screen and something happens, then I will take his or her hand and I will do hand under hand so that they can ride along with me rather than, taking control of his or her arm. And I will touch just to let him or her know that, hey, if you touch the screen, something happens. Okay. But then I get rid of that very quickly. Other times on high-tech communication devices, a lot of times the time that I need it, when I'm asking individuals to touch the speech bar at the top of the screen. So after they've formulated their utterance and are ready to say their complete utterance and sentence, touching the speech bar at the top will read the whole thing. And so a lot of times individuals don't realize that that speech bar is a button, at the top. And so I'll take, a brief demonstration and say, look, if you touch this, then it says your whole sentence. But again, I fade that very, very quickly. Those are the only two times that I will even consider using physical prompting. Okay. The important part is the waiting in there. So number 8, physical assistance is on there. I almost just take that off when I work with individuals using therapy. Direct model is usually where I go down to, but begin with a pause at the top, allow the individual to communicate. Silence is your best friend. If you can go, that creates a huge need to communicate. Okay, when I do this live with individuals, invariably somebody speaks up, asks questions, starts laughing, will make sounds. We as a human species hate silence. Okay, but as therapists and helping individuals use AAC, we need to embrace silence because it actually encourages communication. And so that's often where we start with that least amount of prompting is silence or asking a question and then pausing. How are you today? Okay, we want to quickly fill in those answers. And so we move to prompting very quickly rather than waiting. All right, another least to most example, non-spoken prompt hierarchy, provide environmental cue and pause. So again, that's something like maybe asking a question, or another one of my favorites is just going, and you'll be surprised at the amount of communication that elicits with individuals. So gestures, so that can be pointing to the communication system, just indicating, hey, now's your time to communicate. Okay. For those of you that watch Wheel of Fortune, I refer to that as the Vanna White movement, where we go to your communication tool and say, hey, this is something you could use right now. Pointing directly to it, the word to communicate, using your finger point or a light as shown on here. I do use laser pointers and flashlights at times to draw attention to communication systems. Word of caution with laser pointers, when you point them at computer screens, they usually bounce off somewhere. And so you do want to be careful how you're aiming that laser pointer, that it's not bouncing off back at the individual. Okay, so that's just a word of caution there. Or provide the full physical model where you model on the communication system and then you pause. Okay, and wait for that response. So this is a prompting hierarchy received from the AAC Language Lab from PRC. And you can see the prompting hierarchy again, similar: pausing, open-ended questions, partial prompt, request for verbalization, tell me what you want, or you need to ask me, okay, or you need to use a whole sentence. Now, I will edit here with the phrase of using a whole sentence, okay? I think that's a little overemphasized sometimes. How are you? Fine. Okay, that's a one-word answer. I don't need to go, how are you? Oh, I am feeling very fine today. Thank you for asking. Right? That's not how we communicate or ask. And so what I'll base that on is, was the message communicated effectively? Would it be understood? Is a sentence required here? Was a single word answer enough? Was a couple word answer enough? Um, Part of individuals communicating on augmentative and alternative communication is communicating with speed. And so sometimes they'll create a telegraphic message with just the important words to communicate what they want to say faster, rather than formulating a full sentence as well. So we do need to take that into consideration. Okay. And then again, providing a full model on the communication tool. This is from the Tobii Dynavox toolkit, the chain of cues. And again, starting out independent, where the utterance is generated spontaneously. Natural environment, something in an environment cued the response. If we see a drink on the table, we say, oh, I'm thirsty, or oh, I'd like a drink. Or I refer to this as the bathroom trip in the classroom, right? Where one student raises his or her hand and then all of a sudden everybody else has to go to the bathroom too. So that was a natural environmental trigger for that. If you go outside and it's too hot, and that triggers you to communicate, man, it's hot. I need a drink, or I need to go back inside, something like that. So indirect cue, again, that's kind of that showing moment of, hey, this might be a good tool to use over there, your book, your device, your keyboard, your, whatever you're using. A point cue, which is where you start to point directly to the word. So, hey, this is the word that you might be looking for here, judging on your response. And the physical cue, hand under hand, and again, replace quickly with modeling. Again, any kind of physical hand cue, I only resort to, again, if the person just doesn't physically know how to operate something or how to work something, and very quickly fade that. So what I find is, for the families and schools that I work with, those prompting hierarchies are great, but they're also a lot to remember, especially if you're not a trained therapist, right? So that's something we need to keep in mind as well. We do this for a living, whereas, typically the people we're helping are not speech therapists. And so remembering 8 steps, 6 steps, 10 steps to a prompting hierarchy is difficult for individuals. So I kind of I reduce it in therapy, and I've been pretty successful clinically with it. And so what I generally run by is, for someone who's not independently using AAC yet, model speaking on the AAC tool, waiting, indirect cueing. Again, that's that showing, point prompting. Here's the word you may want to use here, and then modeling on the device. Okay, and you'll see physical prompting isn't on there. For someone more independent in using AAC, I'll use waiting and responding or recasting through modeling. So that's when I'll take his or her utterance and I'll add to it, okay? And talk about what he or she did. So I had an individual who the other day let me know that he and his parents had a campfire at night at their house. And so he said something to the effect of, mom, dad, me, fire, night. Okay. And so then what we did was recast it, modeling on the device, which acknowledges what he says, takes his words, which makes him automatically interested in it, which is great. Any child, verbal or nonverbal, speaking or non-speaking, loves when you imitate what they say, right? That's how you keep conversation going. And so we recast on his device. Oh, you're saying I had a fire with mom and dad on his device. Yeah, that's it. Okay, great. And that models the utterance for him to be able to use. All right, so that's generally the way I break it down in working with individuals and families. So this is the case study that I mentioned earlier. Oh, before we get into this case study, I want to take this moment and give you the codes that you need for this webinar. So thank you for participating in this webinar. And to obtain a certificate of completion, you must fill out the form at the certificate of completion link provided on the email for this training. Please write down this code as it will be required to receive the certificate. MC0222023. The code is, one more time, MC0222023. Okay, I'll give you a minute just to write that down. All right, moving on into the case study here. This is an individual that I worked with. I met him when he was 3 years, 7 months, and diagnosed with Phelan-McDermid syndrome and autism. He presented with a low muscle tone. He was non-speaking and intermittently followed single-step familiar directions. So things that he knew about, he could do. There were a lot of sensory concerns in there with him. And when I met him, he was using PECS. Now he was on phase 3 with picture discrimination. Okay. And so I picked up with what he was using when I met him, because I like to see what he's using, how he's using it, how it's being effective, so on and so forth. And so he was working on discrimination, identifying the difference between two pictures. And we picked preferred and non-preferred items for him. One was a book, which was the non-preferred item, and the other was food and snack, which he was hungry. So we knew he wanted that at that particular time. So we used if you think about the Mayor Johnson symbols, the symbol for book that we used is a red book. And then we use the picture of the snack item for snacks. And working with him, what happened was he picked the book every time. And we responded to his request as if intentional. And we'd say, okay, here's your book. You can read it. And he'd shove it back every time. And we put the picture back. And we'd say, okay, well, what do you want? And he would pick the book again and hand it to us. And we'd give him the book, just like, as if intentional. And he would shove the book back. Well, this continued to go on over a couple of sessions. And here again is that point where we start to ask, what's happening here? What's going on? And again, there's two roads that we could take. One is, well, he can't do it, so we just need to keep working on this until he gets it. Or two, what am I doing here? Or what is happening here that is not allowing him to be successful? Because he has some definite preferences going on. And he knows what he wants. And he knows what he's trying to communicate to us in that particular instance. So what's happening here? And so with this individual, we actually did an evaluation for augmentative and alternative communication. And we found out that voice output and the feedback, the auditory feedback, was what he needed. And he responded to that. Okay, so we got him a high-tech communication device with the voice output and the auditory feedback for him. Great. Okay, so we reduced the number of buttons on the screen for him because he was a beginning communicator and just couldn't quite find out where to go. And so we reduced it to a lower amount of buttons, I think 3 at the time that we were doing, and he still wasn't accessing those. And we said, okay, well, maybe 3 is too much. And so we reduced him down to 1 button. And this device also had a key guard on it as well to compensate for his fine motor issues. And the key guard is, if you're not familiar with it, it's a piece of plastic that layers over the device with cutouts for each button to help guide your finger in as you make the selections. We also made the background of the device black so that the button that was showing showed up bright and white. Okay, so there we were. We held up the device for him because he was smaller at that time and it was more difficult for him to carry it around and move around in the immediate environment. He also didn't understand the purpose of it yet because he hadn't really used it, so it wasn't important for him yet to move it around. Good to know that later on down the road he did, and he seeks out his device to use to communicate now. But what we saw was, instead of selecting the very obvious button that was there for him, he selected the dark areas on the screen. And we said, what is going on here? Okay, and again, we asked that question in the manner not, why isn't he can't do it, to what are we not doing to allow him to be successful? So enter the magic wand. Okay, we made a It initially started out as a red pipe cleaner, and then it ended up being a 3D printed red wand. All of a sudden, when we held up the red wand and put over the button, boom, he found it. Okay. We could grab his attention from across the room with this red wand, and he could see it and he could push the button. What we found out was there's probably some undiagnosed cortical visual impairment going on. Okay. The way that he was reacting in his environment. And for whatever reason, red is the color that stood out to him. Big aha moment, because back in Peck's discrimination phase, the book was red, and that's what stood out to him. And that's probably why he kept picking it. Okay. So with this wand, we were able to help him find the buttons on the device, and the auditory feedback helped him. And he was able to remember positions of the buttons on the device based on the auditory feedback, and we could reduce use of the wand for him. Okay. But because we kept asking those questions, what are we doing or what are we not doing? We were able to find that solution for him. Okay. So if prompting levels are not improving, we need to change something. We either need to raise expectations, we're making things too simple and the individual doesn't really care about participating because this is not something that's challenging to me. We need to reevaluate the features that are needed, such as with that young man who was using PECS phase 3 to communicate. We need to observe facilitator usage. Okay, so again, is it operator error or is it user error? So we have to figure that out. How do we support expansion? We use descriptive feedback, okay? And it serves 3 functions. It immediately acknowledges that the listener heard the student or young child. It confirms that the message sent by the student or the young child is the one that's understood by the listener. And it can be used as a model to expansion of the message expressed by the student or child. Okay. So this is a replacement of good job. All right. We hear that a lot. Good job. Good work. Good job. That doesn't provide us really any information. Okay. And it doesn't provide the individual any information. What did good job mean there? Instead, descriptive feedback could be, oh, you asked for a drink? Let's go get a drink. Oh, you thought that was funny? I think that was funny too. Let's talk about that some more. Okay. I love you, mom. Oh, I love you too, son or daughter, right? So descriptive feedback is responding to the utterance that he or she creates rather than saying good job. Okay. And socially, good job is very awkward as well. Right. So if I walk up to somebody and I say, hey, how you doing? And they say, oh, hi, Mike, how are you? And I say, good job. Breaks the conversation. Right. Instead, we respond, oh, how am I? I'm doing okay today. Yeah, not too bad. And move on from there. So we need to think about the feedback that we're providing the individual. If we're hearing good job, good job, good job, good job, we definitely need to change that to descriptive feedback because it provides that individual information on exactly what he or she did that was successful. It also lets them evaluate whether their message was communicated effectively if we interpret something as that, okay? And gets their need met. And it confirms that we understood it, and then it allows us to model an expansion. Okay, so if somebody says thirsty, oh, you're telling me I am thirsty. Okay, you must want a drink. What do you want? Okay, and we get to model all of that on the device. And important in there too is we modeled a question, what do you want? Okay, that's another thing we need to model as well. And often what I see left out of the modeling is questions. All right, and we also need to have high expectations and low standards, meaning we have to expect that he or she can do it. He or she can participate. Everybody can communicate, okay? Going back to that young man with Phelan-McDermott syndrome and autism, it would be very easy to assume that, well, he just can't do it, right? But because we kept having high expectations, saying that, you know, there's a way to communicate, he's got some things that he wants to communicate, he definitely interacts with his environment, there's got to be some way to allow him to communicate, okay? And then low standards means allow the mistakes. That is key in therapy. You know, therapy, so to speak, in quotes, as we've talked about before, and working with these individuals with communication devices. It's okay to get something wrong, okay? People are often shocked when I ask a question and I don't point to the right answer on his or her communication system for them to access, and they answer something totally differently. And then right, getting the alarm there. That reminds me. Um, it allows him or her to respond whether it's correct or incorrect. And again, that's increasing that independence, right? Um, many individuals that I initially come into contact, I can tell when there's been a really high level of prompting, because one of two things will happen. I'll ask him or her to communicate, and the first move might be to grab my arm or my hand and saying, tell me, tell me what you want here. Tell me what to do, right? I don't know what you want, so let's get this done, kind of a thing. And then we can move on, right? So there's a lot of that. And the other thing that will happen a lot of the time is nothing. So if I leave an open spot for someone to respond, they won't make a move. They won't reach out to access their communication system. Okay. And I see that quite frequently, because unfortunately there's a lot of hand over hand that's being used, and a lot of, I'm expecting a certain response, and we're going to get you to that response, whatever it is. And so there's times when I meet individuals where I have to sit and wait. Okay. I will have sessions where I just wait for a response, wait for any kind of initiation for that. Put something out that's enticing, ask a question, model something on the communication tool, and then just wait for a response. Okay. And that's oftentimes a new experience for the individuals. So some of them get very frustrated when they make mistakes, because they've been taught that the procedure is to get it right. Okay. So I see some behaviors and acting out in that manner. I see individuals who notice any little small thing. So if you don't give them a cue, they're going to make up their cue. So I had somebody who I worked with, I would ask them a question, and just subconsciously, I would look at the device waiting for a response. He was using an iPad for a communication device. And I would look down at the device for a response. And what I started to notice was that his finger would follow where I was looking. And, I had my idea of what his response might be. And so inadvertently, my eyes tended to fall on that button. I didn't point or prompt, but they tended to fall on that button. Well, I noticed that he was starting to push the buttons that I was falling on. And so I did an experiment with him where I provided an opportunity to response, and I put my eyes on the device and I went like this back and forth. And what I found is when I did that, his hand moved back and forth with my eyes. He had made up his own cue to try to guess whatever it is that I wanted him to respond. Similar story with another individual with autism I was working with. He sat next to his mom, and his mom, not intentionally, would kind of guide him to the button that she thought should be the response on his communication device. And so he would go over there, and mom would kind of go like that, again, not really consciously trying to cue him, just like, oh, I think you want to get that over there. And we noticed that his hand followed his mom's shoulder when he did that. And so we had to remove all movements with these individuals. And we had sessions where literally I had to look for the gentleman who was following me with his eyes, I had to look right at him until he responded. And the individual who's following with the shoulder, we had to sit perfectly still until he responded. And what we did was communicate to them that your response is your response. You don't need to guess what it is that we're trying to get you to think. And what we created was a term that David Copenhaver and Karen Erickson use, cognitive engagement. So now, instead of just trying to guess where to touch, I actually have to come up with my own response, and I have to think about things. And now, I have to engage. Okay. And after some sessions of that, we started to get independent responses. And then we had something to work with, whether it was right or a wrong response. Okay. People ask, how long do you wait? I've had individuals where I've waited multiple sessions. Okay. I will say it usually hasn't taken me more than 3 to 5 sessions to get some initial responses with that. Many times it takes just one session for the individual to start to realize that I'm not going to respond. Now I need to carry that over through multiple sessions so I don't create that situation again. But what we get is individuals independently participating on their device, whether it's right or wrong, and it's okay either way. And that seems kind of like a silly and basic sort of thing to understand, but therapy has been conducted in such a way that there's a right answer to everything. So that's the low standards. We need to allow incorrect answers. We need to allow attempts. We need to allow initiations, and we need to treat them as intentional. Okay, so again, high expectations. These people can do it. Low standards. We need to allow the mistakes and lots of time. And the moral of that story is now we have independence and something to work with versus I could continue that prompting for another 6 months and we'd still be in the same spot as we were before. Okay, but now that we have some independence, we have some things we can work with, and now we can get some real growth with that. All right, thank you for joining me today. I hope you found some useful information in there. And you can feel free to contact me. My contact information is on that initial slide if you have any questions or further information that you might need here. This is a list of citations and just a little helpful thought to keep us going in our professions and in helping these individuals, and also for these individuals themselves, that each day comes with both hands full of possibilities. We just need to be thinking to ourselves, what can we do to allow those two full hands of possibilities for individuals using AAC? All right. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.